The diner was quiet that afternoon, filled with the soft clinking of silverware and the smell of coffee brewing. At a corner booth, an 81-year-old veteran named Henry sat alone, wearing his old army cap that had faded with time. His back was slightly hunched, but his eyes were sharp and proud. He had lived through battles most people only read about, but nothing prepared him for the cruelty he would face that day in his hometown diner. The door swung open, and a group of bikers walked in, loud laughter cutting to the calm air. Most ignored them, but one of the bikers noticed Henry. His eyes narrowed, and without warning, he walked up to the old man. "What's with the hat? Old man, you think anyone cares about your war stories?" he sneered. Henry calmly replied, "I wore this to the brothers who never made it back." That's when a biker, in a shocking moment of disrespect, slapped the frail veteran across the face. Gasps filled the diner. The old man didn't fight back. He simply sat there, dignity unbroken, though his cheek burned red. The room was frozen in disbelief. But one of the waitresses quickly made a call. Just 22 minutes later, the sound of heavy boots echoed outside. The door swung open again, this time not with rowdy bikers, but with a squad of uniformed men, led by Henry's son, a decorated army officer. The diner that had fallen silent now held its breath, waiting for what would come next. What happened that afternoon would become a story whispered for years in the small town, a reminder that while age may slow the body, respect and honor never fade, and some lines should never be crossed. Henry Carter was an old man who carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that came from years of service and sacrifice, though his body now moved slower and his hands trembled when he lifted a cup. At 81, he was a fixture in the small-town diner on Main Street, a place where the scent of bacon and coffee lingered in the air and the sound of cutlery clinking against plates gave comfort to those who came seeking a moment of peace. Henry always sat in the same booth by the window, his faded army cap perched proudly on his head, its stitching frayed with time, but its meaning untouched. The regulars nodded to him with respect. Some even paused to shake his hand, and the waitresses adored him, slipping him extra whipped cream on his pie, or refilling his cup before he even asked. On that particular afternoon, the air outside was heavy with late summer heat, and the diner was quiet except for the hum of the ceiling fan. Henry was halfway through his apple pie when the bell over the door jingled and a group of bikers strode in, their boots thudding against the tile floor, their laughter sharp and intrusive. They were rough men, leather jackets creaking as they moved, eyes scanning the room with a kind of restless energy that demanded attention. Most of the customers lowered their gazes, hoping not to be noticed, but one of the bikers, a tall man with scar running across his cheek, locked eyes on Henry. His lips curled into a sneer as he nudged his friend, muttering something that made the others chuckle, with a swagger that reeked of arrogance. He approached Henry's booth and loomed over the old man. "What's with the hat, old-timer?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Henry looked up slowly, his eyes steady, unshaken by the man's size or tone. "This hat," he said calmly, "is for the brothers I lost, men who never came home." The biker scoffed, his hand slamming against the table, rattling Henry's cup. "Nobody cares about your war stories," he sneered, and before anyone could react, his hand lashed out, striking Henry across the face with a sharp slap that echoed through the diner. Gasps filled the room as forks clattered against plates, and a waitress dropped her tray, coffee spilling across the floor. Henry's head turned from the blow, his cheek already glowing red, but he didn't raise his voice or his hands. He simply sat there, breathing steady, his eyes filled not with fear, but with something deeper, something that made the biker shift uncomfortably, even in his arrogance. The diner was frozen in silence, every pair of eyes fixed on the scene, the weight of what had just happened settling heavily in the air. Emily, the young waitress who had always treated Henry like her own grandfather, felt her chest tighten with rage and fear. Her fingers shook as she reached her phone hidden behind the counter, her mind racing to one thought. Call a son that Emily's hands trembled as she punched in the number, her voice shaking when Captain James Carter answered on the other end. She barely managed to get the words out, telling him through broken breaths that his father had been struck, that someone had dared to lay hands on the man who wore his service cap with such pride. There was a long silence before James spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying kind of authority that only years in the army could shape. Stay calm. I'm coming. Those 3 words carried more weight than anyone in the diner realized, for James was not just a soldier. He was a leader, a man who had commanded respect on battlefields far from home. Emily hung up, her heart still racing, while Henry sat quietly in his booth, his cheeks stinging but his pride untouched, refusing to rub the mark as though to prove it hadn't broken him. Around him, whispers rippled through the diner, some customers muttering in disbelief, others glaring at the bikers, but no one daring to stand up. The biker who had struck Henry smirked, puffing out his chest as though proud of his cruelty, and his friends laughed loudly, mocking the silence that had followed their violence. Henry, however, remained composed, sipping his coffee with steady hands, his silence louder than any protest could have been. 22 minutes passed, each one dragging like an eternity, the atmosphere so tense that even the clink of a spoon seemed out of place. Then, the sound of engines filled the air outside, not the roar of motorcycles, but the disciplined rumble of army vehicles pulling into the lot. Heads turned toward the window as the sight of camouflage uniforms and shining boots stepped out in unison, their presence alone enough to send a ripple of unease through the diner. The door swung open, and in strode Captain James Carter, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed with perfection, his expression unreadable but his eyes blazed with controlled fury. Behind him, several soldiers followed, their boots striking the floor in a rhythm that spoke of discipline and power. The room fell into absolute silence as James scanned the diner, his gaze first landing on his father, who sat with unshaken composure, and then shifting to Biker, who still stood smugly near the booth. "Did you lay a hand on my father?" James asked, his voice calm but carrying a sharpness that cut through the air like a blade. The Biker, who had moments earlier seemed untouchable, faltered under the weight of that stare. His smirk wavered, his bravado slipping as the soldiers behind James stood tall, their silence more intimidating than any shouted threat. The other customers sat frozen, hardly daring to breathe, as the confrontation that had started with a single slap now stood on the edge of something much larger. Henry finally lifted his eyes to his son, pride shining through his calm expression, and with that unspoken connection, James squared his shoulders, ready to show the Biker and everyone watching that some lines once crossed could never be ignored. The diner had never felt so tense. Every pair of eyes locked on the confrontation that was unfolding between the proud army captain and the reckless Biker who had crossed a line no one in the room could forgive. James stood tall, his hands steady at his sides, but the storm in his eyes spoke louder than any raised voice could. The Biker tried to laugh, a shaky sound that betrayed the crack in his confidence, and muttered, "It was just a joke. Old man can't take a little smack." His words, instead of easing the tension, tightened the noose of silence around him, for everyone in the diner knew there was nothing funny about striking an 81-year-old veteran. James took a slow step closer, his boots echoing on the tiled floor, and said, "My father wore that cap for men who never came home. You think it's funny to dishonor that?" His tone was even, but his words carried the weight of generations of sacrifice. The soldier behind him didn't move, but their presence was like a wall, their eyes locked firmly on the Biker and his crew, who suddenly seemed less bold than they had minutes ago. The Biker's friends shifted uneasily, their shoulders stiff, their earlier laughter long gone, replaced by nervous glances toward the door as if escape might be their only option. Henry, still seated in his booth, lifted his cup and sipped calmly, his quiet composure more powerful than any outburst could have been, and his presence seemed to fuel his son's strength. James drew another step closer until he stood inches from the Biker, his voice dropping to a whisper that the entire diner still somehow heard. "You will apologize to my father. Right now." The Biker swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room for support he no longer had, but all he found were stares of disgust from strangers who now saw him for what he was, a coward hiding behind noise and swagger. He opened his mouth, hesitation breaking his tough mask, and finally stammered, I'm sorry, sir." The apology was weak, reluctant, but it was still an apology. Henry met the man's eyes for the first time since the slap, his own gaze unwavering, and gave a small nod as though acknowledging the words, though not granting forgiveness so easily. James, however, wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his voice firm and final. You remember this moment every time you think about disrespecting someone who gave you the freedom to sit on that bike of yours. The biker looked down, unable to meet his stare, his bravado completely stripped away. Slowly, James stepped back, his hand briefly touching his father's shoulder, a silent reassurance that he was safe, that he was never alone. The soldiers relaxed their stance, but did not let their eyes waver from the group of bikers, who now shuffled awkwardly toward the door, their confidence gone, their exit marked not by arrogance but by shame. The diner, once silent, began to stir with murmurs of relief and admiration. The customers, realizing they had just witnessed not only a son defending his father, but respect itself being demanded in the most powerful way possible, as the bikers pushed their way out of the diner, their leather jackets brushing against the doorframe. The tension that had gripped the room seemed to release all at once, but the silence lingered like smoke after a fire. James stood in the center of the room, his posture still rigid, his breathing controlled. Though inside his chest his heart beat hard with a mixture of anger, relief, and the fierce protective love only a son could feel. The soldiers who had entered with him maintained their quiet watch until he gave a slight nod, a signal that the danger had passed, and only then did they ease their stance. Their discipline unbroken even in a small-town diner filled with townsfolk who could not stop staring. Henry set down his coffee cup gently, his hand steady, and looked up at his son with a gaze that carried pride, gratitude, and a touch of sorrow that his boy, now a man hardened by his own years of service, had been forced to bear the weight of such ugliness on his behalf. James moved to the booth and slid into the seat across from him, his broad frame almost filling the space, and for a moment they said nothing, letting the quiet be their language. Emily finally broke the stillness, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, are you all right?" "Captain Carter, thank you." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, and the other customers began to nod, their murmurs of respect spreading into the entire diner, seemed to hum with a shared reverence for the old man and his son, who had offended him with such unshakable strength. Henry gave a small smile, brushing a hand across the red mark still visible on his cheek, and said softly, "I've faced worse, dear. A slap doesn't break a man. Forget that. Remember this." He gestured toward his son. "This is what it means to stand up." James's jaw tightened at his father's words. The reminder of the battles Henry had endured, making the slap seem so small in comparison. Yet the insult had been intolerable precisely because of what his father represented. A living reminder of sacrifice, of honor, of a generation that had given everything. One by one, the customers rose from their seats, some stepping forward to shake Henry's hand, others clapping James on the shoulder, until the dine was filled with quiet applause, not loud or showy, but heartfelt, a collective acknowledgement of the moment they had just witnessed. The soldiers remained near the door, watchful but ease, their presence a shield that needed no words. James leaned forward, lowering his voice so only his father could hear. "You're not alone, Dad. You'll never be alone." Henry met his son's eyes, and in them was a reflection of all the years he had lived, all the battles he had fought, and the deep comfort of knowing his legacy was not only remembered but carried forward. The diner, once just a place for coffee and pie, had become a place where respect had been restored, where a line had been drawn, and where everyone present would leave with a story they would never forget. When the diner finally began to return to its ordinary rhythm, the clatter of dishes and the hiss of the coffee machine sounding once more, the weight of what had happened still hung in the air, though now it carried a different kind of gravity, not fear but reverence. Henry remained in his booth, his posture straighter than before, as though the ordeal had reminded him of the strength that had carried him through decades of hardship. James sat beside him, not as a captain commanding soldiers, but as a son ensuring his father was safe. The boy who once looked up to a war hero now standing as a protector in his own right. The bikers were long gone, their arrogance dissolved into the shame of their own actions, and though they had left no physical damage behind, the mark of their disrespect would forever serve as a lesson to all who had witnessed it. Emily approached quietly with a fresh slice of pie and a steaming cup of coffee for Henry, her hand steadier now, her eyes soft with admiration. "On the house," she said gently, setting them down as though offering more than food, but a gesture of respect, and Henry gave her a nod that spoke volumes. Around the diner, Customers continue to whisper, not gossip, but stories already being shaped into something larger. The kind of tale that would be told for years in hushed tones whenever Henry's name came up, a story not about weakness, but about honor restored. James rose from the booth for a moment, addressing the room with simple words, his voice calm but commanding. This man deserves respect, not because he is my father, but because men like him built the freedom we all stand in today. There was no applause this time, no dramatic response, only a deep silence of agreement, the kind that carried more weight than noise ever could. He then returned to his father's side, his hand resting briefly on Henry's shoulder, a silent promise that no matter how old he grew, he would never face the world alone. As the soldiers filed out one by one, their boots striking in perfect unison, the sound lingered like an echo of strength, a reminder that dignity would always be defended when threatened. Henry finished his pie slowly, savoring each bite as though it were proof that life, even after humiliation, could still be sweet. When they finally left the diner together, father and son walked side by side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows behind them, their bond stronger and more visible than ever. To the people watching from the windows, it was not just the end of an incident, but the conclusion of a lesson that age might weather the body, but honor does not fade, and that the greatest strength is not in fists or noise, but in the quiet, unshakable respect that one generation passes to the next. And so, the story of the slap did not end with anger, but with father's dignity restored, a son's love proven, and a community reminded that some values, once tested, shine brighter than ever. Backhand index pointing right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Backhand index pointing right. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful and emotional stories every week.